Good morning to friends joining us, colleagues joining us from Singapore or Tokyo or Shanghai. Good evening to friends joining us from New York or Washington or Baltimore. And good, whatever it is for the rest of you, afternoon or morning. I'm Michael Green. I'm the Director of Asian Studies at the Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and also Senior Vice President at the CSIS, Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. And I'm delighted to moderate today's discussion. This is one in the series of Asia-Pacific dialogue events we're holding under the aegis of the U.S.-China Dialogue Initiative at Georgetown, an initiative designed to enhance dialogue between the U.S. and China, but also about China, China in Asia, China in Europe, China in the world, and also co-sponsored by the Asian Studies program at Georgetown, which I direct. And welcome to our students from the Masters in Asian Studies and from the other parts of Georgetown. We're going to talk to three very distinguished scholars from Southeast Asia about how China looks from their part of the world, but also how the US looks, how the Biden administration's strategic competition with China is playing in Southeast Asia, how thought leaders in the region view other important actors, Japan, Australia, India, Korea, the EU. We want to understand how our friends and partners in Southeast Asia see economic factors, see questions of democracy and values, deterrence, defense, and diplomacy. So we have a lot to get to. We want to think about this because Southeast Asia is, many argue, the arena of competition between the US and China, or Japan and China, Australia and China. But of course, ASEAN is an increasingly important economic center of the world in its own right. And through the 10-member Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN member states had at one point success and would like to have success again, centering diplomacy in the region on their part of Asia, on what's called ASEAN centrality. And that's off the rails a bit, but we'll talk about ASEAN's agency and how capitals in Southeast Asia view the long-term future of relations with a very complicated China and United States these days. So joining us are three friends and colleagues. Renato Cruz de Castro from the Philippines. He's distinguished professor in the Department of International Studies and holds the Dr. Aurelio Calderon Chair in Philippine-American Relations at De La Salle University in Manila. He's been a visiting fellow and researcher at NIDS, at the Japanese Defense Ministry. He's also been at the Japan Institute for International Affairs, a Japan expert after my own heart, at the East-West Center in Hawaii, and he was an alum of the Daniel Inouye Asia Pacific Center, APCSS, associated with Indo-PACOM. Hu Changbun is joining us from Singapore. He's an associate professor and coordinator of the China program at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, RSIS, very famous think tank at Nanyang Technological University, NTU, in Singapore. His books include China's Global Identity, Considering the Responsibilities of Great Power. We'll ask more about that shortly. Chinese Foreign Policy under Xi, and Chinese Regionalism in Asia, Beyond the Belt and Road Initiative. He's been very active in first and second track dialogue initiatives, including the Singapore-US Strategic Dialogue, the Vietnam-Singapore Strategic and Security Dialogue, dialogues with France, Korea, China, and so forth. And Bích Thị Tran is an adjunct fellow in the Southeast Asia program led by Greg Poling at CSIS in Washington. She has her PhD from the University of Antwerp and is fellow at the Verve Research Institute. She's been a visiting research fellow at the Global Affairs Research Center, the East-West Center, Ritsumeikan in Japan. And she's the author of several publications, including From Rebalance to Asia to Free and Open Indo-Pacific, the development of the US-Vietnam Comprehensive Partnership, published 2 years ago. So let's get right to it. I'm going to start, Renato, with you, since you are obviously on vacation in some beautiful island in the Philippine archipelago. So we're going to make you work. Broadly, Renato, how does China look to the Philippines these days? Friend, partner, adversary, bromance? love, hate? How would you describe the
Yeah.
Philippines collective or
Well,
individual views?
I'll say it's the most polarizing issue in the Philippines. You know, whereas before, when the bases were here, it was the United States. Now it's basically China. And this accounts for the fact of, you know, the debate happening here. Of course, since 2016, you have this administration that has adopted a policy of appeasing China under the Duterte administration. This appeasement is marked, of course, by efforts to separate the Philippines from its alliance with the United States. Of course, also setting aside the arbitral ruling that came out in July 2016 and basically engaging China, you know, Chinese terms in terms of addressing the South China Sea dispute. Number one, bilateral negotiations, and of course, joint development. On the other hand, of course, you have the pushback from the civil society, from the military, who of course has this traditional suspicious view of China. And this is not helped by Chinese coercive action, despite the efforts of this administration to cut a deal with China. You know, despite the fact that President Duterte has met Xi Jinping in Beijing in 2016 and basically told Xi Jinping, we're moving away from the United States. Chinese coercive actions in the South China Sea have continued. Just a case in point, you know, just 2 weeks after the Philippines, President Duterte decided to abrogate the visiting force agreement, you have an incident in the South China Sea where you have a Chinese corvette directed its gun control system against a Philippine frigate. So you have this dynamics going on. If you're talking about the US-China strategic competition in Southeast Asia, it's happening right inside Philippine society. And much more, something we could be discussing later, the election period. We can discuss it later, how this US-China strategic competition is starting to play up in the coming presidential election. I end here.
Let me ask you one or two follow-ups
Sure.
for now. You know, you said it's polarizing, and that's true in other countries. Many countries are getting over their polarization. Australia, for example, or even the US. Would you just, what characterizes the two groups? Is one group the Davao group around President Duterte versus the Manila elite? How does the debate over China break down? Does it break down over interest groups, the business community versus the military? Or is it more complicated than that, like everything in Philippines politics?
It's more complicated than ever. Well, even within the government, you have taken this into account. President Duterte in 2016 announced, you know, separating from the United States, going to China. But recently you have noticed a change in Philippine government pronouncement, deciding to put on track the visiting forces agreement, then praising AUKUS. Secretary Locsin praised AUKUS in contrast to some other Southeast Asian countries. In November this year, we signed a joint vision for the Philippine-US alliance, something that was unthinkable way back in 2016. When President Duterte said, you know, I'm separating from the United States. Now we have a joint vision for the alliance. Then, of course, you'll have again joint military exercises, live fire exercises that will be held in areas near Taiwan. So even within the government, you see this sort of dynamics going on. So again, you know, the characteristic here in the Philippines is the fact, of course, that, you know, we have been a strategic ally of the United States. Philippine population is basically not necessarily pro-US, but we value our trans-Pacific connections. Then, of course, you have China trying to make inroads in terms of infrastructure project, which of course failed, but we cannot take into account, of course, trade, plus, of course, the Filipino-Chinese community here in the Philippines.
And the very important Philippine-American community as well in the United States.
Yes, of course. Why I call it trans-Pacific. Yeah, the transnational connection. Every Filipino family has an American relative.
Yes. Good. We'll come back to some of that. Chang Boon.
Okay.
Chang Boon, Singapore, perhaps more than any country in Southeast Asia, is desperate to maintain global integration and prevent decoupling and prevent a splinter net. Singapore is a global trading state. So this competition is fundamentally against Singapore's vision for Southeast Asia and the world. But so far, Singapore is towing that balance very, very carefully? How do senior scholars like yourself in Singapore see this competition? How do you look at China?
Right, great question, Mike. First of all, I'd like to thank Georgetown University and yourself for inviting me here. I'm delighted to be here. In response to your question, you're right. I think for the longest time, Singapore has been trying to tread a fine line between the US and China. And this is in part linked to Singapore's ambition and vision for itself as a regional hub, if not a global hub, right? So from Singapore's point of view, we want more trade, more people flows, and in particular to flow through Singapore. But so you have all these connections, you have all these economic linkages. It's good for us. It's how we position ourselves. So when you have long-term competition, I think to some extent competition, if it can be contained, will be healthy, right? But the worry is that if it leads to a form of decoupling, and even worse, two forms of economic orders, then obviously this would increase the cost for business and transactions. So I think that's the part which policymakers and scholars are concerned about. But so far it hasn't happened yet, but this is something to watch out.
I'm sure, Chung Boon, you've read the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies survey. I know that's a rival institution in Singapore, but I'm sure you read all their work as I do. And what struck me, and also in surveys I've done at CSIS, what struck me is as elites in the Philippines and Vietnam and Indonesia in particular grow more and more alarmed at China's behavior, more and more desirous of Japan or India or America or the EU to counterbalance. At the same time that's happening, the surveys in Singapore show relatively little change, it seems, among elite opinion. There doesn't seem to be quite the same backlash against China in Singapore, at least in those surveys. If you've seen, I'm sure you've seen the Yusuf Ishak ICS surveys. Is that just that Singapore is the most disciplined strategic player in Southeast Asia, or is there something in Singapore that makes the Chinese behavior a little more tolerable?
Okay, I need to qualify that this is our own personal view.
Of course.
But my interpretation is that it depends on when those surveys are being asked. The most recent ones, was canvassed in 2021. So it sort of reflects the current benign trajectory and positive trajectory of relations between both countries. But if you were to take those survey in 2017, in 2016, when 9 of our infantry carrier vehicles were detained in Hong Kong on the way back from military exercises in Taiwan, I'm sure those sentiments will be different. And also during that time, there were pressure being put by China, and openly as well. Claims of how Singapore is trying to internationalize the South China Sea issue, right? But ever since then, I think from 2017 onwards, at the highest political levels, relations have stabilized. So from that point onwards, I see some kind of equilibrium in Singapore-China relations, and this probably has reflected in those surveys as well.
That's interesting. So Singapore is not seen as a steady deterioration. It had a bad period, but now it's more stable in ties with China. I was in Singapore actually in November. I was a speaker at the Bloomberg New Economy Forum. It was wonderful to travel. It was my only trip to Asia this whole time in COVID. And the government managed the pandemic extremely well. And average citizens were empowered to yell at anyone who didn't have a mask on, as I discovered. But one thing I did was I met with a group of former students, Singaporeans in their 20s, some in government, some in the private sector. And they seem to have a somewhat different view, particularly because of developments in Hong Kong. But that was just anecdotal. I just met with a group of former students. Is there a generational difference in how Singaporeans think about China?
There could be. I need to also mention that the surveys are one thing, but my own sense is that there's always been a certain amount of sensitivity or at least concerns about growing Chinese pressure in the region. And that's one of the reasons why, for the longest time, Singapore have been a strong advocate of American presence, at least attention on this region. If the Americans are not paying attention to this region, Singaporean scholars and policymakers will make noise, right? They
Yes.
want the US to be engaged, and the reason is obvious, because to hedge or balance against rising Chinese influence and power, right? And then this power and influence has implications on us.
Yeah.
And the thing I actually wanted to mention in my opening remarks is that something which is often forgotten is that Singapore is the only polity that has an ethnic Chinese majority population outside of China and Taiwan, right? So obviously this has certain domestic political implications, right? I think the concern, for Singapore is that with the rise of China, it could potentially stir ethnic pride among segments of the Chinese majority population in Singapore. And this, could potentially lead to Chinese chauvinism, or could potentially undermine the multiracial compact in Singapore, right? And there's also worry that for certain segments of the population, for certain misguided reasons, they start to see themselves first as Chinese rather than Singaporean. Right? This would obviously have political implications, not just domestically, and potentially on our foreign policy as well. And this is something which we are watching and trying to guard against.
Very interesting. I mean, Lee Kuan Yew made a deliberate decision that Singapore's national language would be English to avoid precisely that kind of internal
That's right.
Friction. Vic, Vietnam has, in all the surveys, Vietnamese thought leaders are the toughest on China within ASEAN. And yet at the same time, Vietnam's a socialist republic, right? And has some, at least the government has some common, basis for friendship with China. What's the sense you have of the Vietnamese view within ASEAN of China's growing role and ambitions?
Yeah, so for Vietnam as a country, China is the most important partner and at the same time the biggest threat. So Vietnam wants to have, to maintain close ties with China for two main reasons. The first one is that the two countries are among the only 5 remaining communist regime in the world. And after the collapse of the communist bloc in Eastern Europe, Beijing and Hanoi felt the urgent need to normalize and consolidate their political relations. And the ties between the two communist parties have played an essential role in stabilizing the China-Vietnam relationship. And their leaders hold regular meetings, which provide opportunities for discussions on various outstanding issues in the bilateral relationship and find common ground. And maintaining stable economic relations with China is also crucial for Vietnamese economy. So China has been Vietnam's largest trading partner since 2004. And by 2020, China is Vietnam's largest import market and the second largest export market after the United States. In terms of investment, China was Vietnam's 8th largest FDI source in 2008, and now it's moved up to the 5th rank in 2020. So in July 2008, the two countries signed the China-Vietnam Comprehensive Strategic Cooperative Partnership. It's the highest level of cooperation that Vietnam has with a partner country. Although the signing of the partnership has led to increased bilateral cooperation, serious challenges remain, especially in the South China Sea disputes. So China has signed the Declaration of the Conduct of the Parties in the South China Sea in 2002. It also promised to act on the agreements reached between Chinese and Vietnamese leaders. And together with Vietnam in 2011, the two countries signed the agreement on basic principles guiding the settlement of the maritime issues. However, China's, seen the partnerships side, China has expanded its claims to almost the entire South China Sea with so-called Nine Dash Line, and increased its administrative activities over disputed area, interfere with Vietnam's economic activities in its EEZ, and intruded into Vietnam waters several times. And it was also converted rock and reef to artificial island and even militarized the features. Besides the South China Sea, Vietnam's heavy dependence on Chinese intermediate and capital goods also present another challenge. Given Beijing's record of using trade as a weapon and the disputes between the two countries, Vietnam's trade dependence on China just creates, vulnerability in its production chain. If something happened in the South China Sea and China imposed some, trade embargo, then it will be, disrupted, Vietnam's production. And so in managing its relations with China, Vietnam has employed strategic hedging. It's a set of multiple approaches which act simultaneously as a strategy to help the state to minimize their threats while maximizing their opportunities in relations with other nations and in an uncertain environment. So the first element of Vietnam's hedging is diplomatic engagement, which entails a network of communication, especially the party-to-party relations, to aim, at building mutual trust and then calling for China to act responsibly. And the second component is economic engagement, for Vietnam's development. And the third one is internal hard balancing, in which Vietnam has tried to improve its military capabilities. And fourth, with soft balancing, Vietnam has formed partnerships with other major powers to balance against China. And amongst those, the United States is the most critical one due to its ability and willingness to defy China's aggression in the South China Sea. Although the United States has become increasingly important in Vietnam's foreign policy, the relationship is not free from tensions. And among the Vietnamese leaders, there is a suspicion about a perceived peaceful evolution that US support for pro-democracy descendants and promotion of higher human rights standards is aimed at overthrowing the Vietnamese Communist Party. So while common concern over China has brought Vietnam and the United States closer to each other, I want to give more credit to Vietnam in shaping its foreign relations. Hanoi's decision to form partnership with both Beijing and Washington signal an adjustment in Vietnam's grand strategy. So it no longer sees any countries as mere partner or mere challengers. In each country, there are aspects with which Vietnam can cooperate, and there are some other aspects against which Vietnam must fight. And this change in perception of friends and foes allows Vietnam to build closer relationship with both China, despite the ongoing dispute in the South China Sea, and with the United States, regardless the suspicion about US intention. Yeah, so I will stop here and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Vic. I've noticed that Vietnam, I was in Hanoi just before COVID, one of my last trips overseas, and I always enjoy visiting Vietnam for many reasons, but the conversations are always very strategic. And I've noticed over the years that Hanoi is willing to make some adjustments or accommodations on human rights issues. For example, joining TPP and agreeing to labor rights. And just recently, the foreign minister, I think it was the foreign minister in Tokyo, said Vietnam would make further reforms to its politics to improve trade and investment, because China is not making those reforms. So it's always interesting to me, Vietnam is willing to make these changes, even including changes in religious freedom and the most sensitive issues. So the United States is a bit threatening in its own way, and yet the hedging has involved some interesting flexibility of ideology in Hanoi as well. Let me, it's interesting, the three of you describe three very different government relations with Beijing. So in Singapore's case, the Chinese side was very heavy-handed in 2016, 17. That was also when the Cambodia chair of ASEAN would not issue a statement on the tribunal ruling against China and for the Philippines. So there was a lot of bad pressure on Singaporean interests from Beijing. But Singapore very effectively managed or regulated Chinese behavior. China did not ramp up its pressure on Singapore. And similarly in Vietnam, the party-to-party relations seem to be an important channel, as Vic points out, to regulate relations. But Renato, Manila doesn't seem to have that. It doesn't seem to have that channel or that ability to regulate relations, to send clear signals to Beijing. Or is it something else? Is it just that Beijing just thinks it can get away with it? What do you think?
Well, one factor here, of course, is geography and history. We're separated by the South China Sea from China.
Mhm.
So we have that flexibility compared to Vietnam. Vietnam would have to play this, how I would call,
I think we lost your signal, Renato. Let me come back to you in just a minute. We may ask you to turn your video off if that makes it easier. But let me ask Chung Boon. Am I right? It seems that Singapore is quite skillful at regulating its signals with Beijing.
Right. I would say that at least since from 2017 onwards, relations have stabilized. I'm not sure whether or not this can be attributed to skill alone. I'm sure the elites, who are handling the relations, I'm sure they're doing well. But I think it also depends on the context, the events. We're different from the case of Vietnam, and certainly different from the case of Philippines, where there's direct conflict of interest, especially when it comes to territorial disputes in the South China Sea. We don't have that. We are not a direct claimant to anything, right? So Singapore's interest is indirect in the form that we want peace and security. We do not want conflict, which could affect our interest as a financial and economic hub, right? So it's our interest comes from the point of seeing ourselves as a financial economic hub, and to that extent, anything that damages that interest of us as a hub, we'll be concerned. So there's no direct conflict of interest.
That's an important distinction. Beijing may want good relations with Manila, Hanoi, and Singapore. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs may work on those good relations, but if the PLA, Navy, and the Chinese Coast Guard and fisheries are expanding in the Spratlys and the Parasols and the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea, that ruins everything. And Singapore's not a claimant, so it doesn't receive that constant barrage. Renato, do you think that's it, or do you think Manila just has a hard time managing China policy?
No, number one, of course, is we have a direct territorial dispute with China.
Yeah.
We see the Philippines as basically on the path of Chinese maritime expansion. Despite efforts by President Duterte to improve that relationship, we have several incidents. The most recent one happened, of course, last year, the Winston Shoal incident, where the Philippines nearly, the Foreign Affairs and Defense Department were talking about invoking the Mutual Defense Treaty until President Duterte entered and said, no, we could not rely on the US. So the other factor here, when China looks at the Philippines, there's still an element of distrust despite President Duterte. And that is, of course, our alliance. We're the formal treaty ally of the United States. The only active. I don't think so much with Thailand, but in the case of the Philippines, still there, despite the efforts by President Duterte. The armed forces of the Philippines basically told President Duterte after he came back from Beijing, what do you mean by separation? We have close ties with the United States in terms of training, in terms of military logistics. So that's the point there. We have direct territorial dispute with China. We are still a formal, despite President Duterte, and I think this will outlive President Duterte or his presidency, our formal security ties with the United States.
Vic, in Hanoi, do you think people expect the Chinese maritime expansion to continue? Is that a worry?
Yes, I think so. Even for the past year, it seemed pretty quiet. But China has been, harassing, Vietnam's neighbor, Malaysia and Indonesia. So I think that there is a concern that, Vietnam will be next. So a period of quietness doesn't mean that changing is changing its behavior.
Let me ask you if you could give Xi Jinping advice. What would you tell him? What countries in Southeast Asia want China to do? Is there an equilibrium or a more durable relationship, a more comfortable relationship with China that you can imagine? What I assume, well, is it finishing the code of conduct for the disputes in the South China Sea, or what? Why don't we start with you, Chang-Boon? What would you tell Xi Jinping? What are 2 or 3 things Beijing could do to just calm down ASEAN and make them a little less worried?
In my view, and again here, this is my own personal view. I do think that to some extent, China over the years, at least since 2013, in certain respects has overplayed their hand, right? And I think China gives rhetorical support to the idea of ASEAN centrality, ASEAN neutrality, and so on and so forth. But a lot of its actions, right? I would say there's a huge divergence in a lot of its words and deeds, right? Supposedly you're not supposed to they promise not to militarize the South China Sea situation, and the reality on the ground is different, right? So if obviously China is a great power, it's a big power, and it's pushing its weight around, but obviously this has strategic repercussions, right? The only thing that this would do is to basically push, perhaps not ASEAN as an organization, but ASEAN states, not discounting those who are already allies, to clamor more for the US, right? And this is, from China's point of view, this is not good in China's interest. So I would probably advise, again here, nobody is saying that China deserves every opportunity it has to grow and to develop, and nobody is saying that we're out there to deny China's legitimate rights and interests. But at the same time, there's a security dilemma, right? China perceives that a lot of things that it's doing is basically to defend itself resolutely and in a legitimate way. But many times it neglects how this could have or undermines the security of its neighboring states. And as a great power, and as a responsible great power for that matter, it's more in its interest to watch out for how some of these could have negative impact. So I would advise for some form of strategic retraction, or certainly change the way in terms of how it manages its relations with ASEAN states. Certainly can tone down a little bit on its wolf warrior diplomacy.
Yeah, Renato, what would you expect, or do you think a more stable relationship with China is just not going to be possible for the Philippines?
It'll be possible. I will advise Xi Jinping 2 things. Number 1, let's discuss the territorial dispute on the basis of the 2016 arbitral ruling. China need not abide by. Let's just discuss. Let's look at the merits. Let's try to look at your historic claim. Let's look what your Coast Guard is doing in my territory. China is also a signatory to UNCLOS. So as 2 members of UNCLOS, in contrary, one of the presidential candidates said, I'm not mentioning his name, China is not a member of UNCLOS. Reflects, of course, his view and ignorance about issues. I won't mention his name. So let's just discuss this. You don't have to abide to. Second one, I will ask China to look at history. The history of the United States in the 1930s, when it adopted a good neighbor policy towards Latin America. So see how the United States has been accepted in the Western Hemisphere as a benign power. So look at, what's the policy of of President Roosevelt when he adopted the policy of good neighbor policy towards, Central America and South America. probably China would learn something from the American experience then. Okay.
Very interesting. Yeah, that second point is very interesting. I'm not sure we're loved. I'm not sure we're loved in Latin America, but the good neighbor policy was reassuring.
At least you won't expand.
Right, and we're
Yeah,
not.
you're not.
That's right.
You know,
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah.
Yeah. You will not claim the entire Caribbean.
So I think the U.S. position is very similar to what you just said, that Beijing should engage based on the 2016 ruling on the tribunal and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. I suspect of the 1.4 billion Chinese, there are probably 5 who agree with that. You know, the righteous, the sovereign position is incredibly powerful and politically popular, of course. So, but that's a reasonable legal and international legal, very reasonable international legal basis for moving forward. Vic, what would Vietnam like from Beijing to establish a more reliable and reassuring relationship?
Yeah, I think that China doesn't, shouldn't push Vietnam too much. So it gets too close to the United States. I think China doesn't want that at all. But, if it keeps the current pace, then it might happen because, in the 2019 white paper, Vietnam said that depending on circumstances, it would consider, forming closer defense ties with other countries. So even though it's very vague, but it was the first time Vietnam, includes such a statement in the white defense paper, kind of pave the way for future circumstances. So even though I don't think that Vietnam would go, far enough to form alliance with other countries or maybe allow the United States to have permanent base in its on its territory. But deepening defense ties, it could entail many things. For example, intelligence sharing, or maybe just get occasional access to the Cam Ranh Bay. So just want to advise China that it shouldn't push Vietnam too much.
You all three of you are very clear, and I've heard Lee Hsien Loong, the Prime Minister of Singapore, articulate very clearly what he would like to see China do to reassure the region. So the message is out there. Now this is sponsored by the U.S.-China Dialogue Initiative, so we also have to talk about the U.S. What would you tell Joe Biden the U.S. needs to do to both maintain a stable balance of power, rules-based order, and not panic everyone in Southeast Asia? Vic, do you want to go first? My friend Dan Crittenbrink, the top Asia hand in the State Department, was ambassador in Vietnam. He knows Vietnam well. He could easily answer this, but what would you advise? What should the U.S. be doing now?
Yeah,
in the context, in the context of China and strategic competition and all of that.
Right. So you mentioned at the beginning that economic aspect is the weakness of US in South Asia. So yeah, without the TPP or CPTPP, then I think with the current, economic Indo-Pacific economic framework, the Biden administration has to work really hard to, deliver some concrete outcomes. And also, Vietnam is heavily dependent on China in terms of trade. So what can the United States do to lessen that? It would be of Vietnam's interest.
So the Secretary of Commerce Raimundo in Singapore, among other places, promised an Indo-Pacific economic framework, and it is supposed to be forthcoming, but it's not going to be the U.S. rejoining CPTPP, and it's not going to be a digital trade agreement. Do you think that's enough for now to hold people's attention in Southeast Asia, or do you think people will be disappointed? Vic, what do you think?
Yeah, I think some elements of the Indo-Pacific economic frameworks, for example, supply chains resilient, may be useful for Vietnam. I just wonder how it will be implemented. Yeah. And also like clean energy. So Vietnam is leading South Asia in terms of solar energy right now. will the two countries can work together to develop that more. Infrastructure, Vietnam's always needs infrastructure, and worker standards. I think that is very sensitive issues, but you mentioned that Vietnam is more willing to reform, and it's actually I want to talk about that more because Vietnam's as a middle power, it wants to be more independent. So it would like to, reform, follow international standards, so to attract investment and, to just raise its status in international affairs. So it lessen the impact of US-China competition.
Yeah, what you're describing is why it's so exciting to go to Hanoi. It's just so dynamic and forward-looking. Let me ask you, Chang Boon, what should Biden do? We heard about the economic. Is that the main thing, or are there other aspects?
I agree entirely with Big that the economic aspect. I think the Biden administration can add meat to its ideas, right? Yeah, you mentioned about the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. So, but I think a lot of Southeast Asian states they're wondering, what's the substance there. So so far I've noticed that the approach of the Biden administration has been that they understand that Southeast Asian states, they want an alternative, an economic alternative to China's BRI, an economic alternative to some of Chinese initiatives, right? But one, there's not much substance as yet thus far on what those initiatives entail. Number two, it looks like a lot of these initiatives required the enlistment of American allies like Japan, maybe, for example, Australia, right? So obviously there'll be coordination issues as well. And what if the ally has certain differing views of how much they want to put in, right? So this could cause some complications as well. And on a broader strategic basis, I would say that probably Singapore would like both powers to have peaceful coexistence. I think we're realistic enough to understand that competition is going to be, some degree of competition is inevitable, right? But having said that, this competition, one, should be healthy. It shouldn't spiral into a form which is detrimental to globalization and international trade, and even worse, a form of inadvertent military conflict. So those are the nightmare scenarios that you don't want to see. And of course, peaceful coexistence in a way that would facilitate international trade and globalization is probably the best scenario from Singapore's point of view.
So before I turn to Renato, I want to remind the audience you can send questions to the panel through the Q&A tab on this Zoom program, and I'll start addressing those questions in just a minute. So Renato, what do you think? What should the people listen to the Philippines? What should the administration do in Washington?
Well, as a Southeast Asian, my knee-jerk reaction will be have Washington's attention to the region, which of course will not happen unless of course you have a major conflict here, unless just like during the Vietnam War. That of course that's a scenario that we don't want to see. We have to understand that Southeast Asia is not a priority. When you have people looking from Washington, they look at Northeast Asia, the alliance. That's where, of course, the United States would come in. Policies in Southeast Asia would have to be with allies. The closest, of course, will be US, Japan. The United States could not simply compete with China economically, probably in insular Southeast Asia, but not in continental Southeast Asia, where you have Japan. Japan, of course, has the willingness. Japan has the resources. Japan has the attention. We have to be realistic about it. The United States is a global power. It has other concerns. Central Europe, Latin America, elsewhere, Middle East. So the United States could only show its importance to Southeast Asia if it, of course, operates with its allies: Japan, South Korea, Australia, and even Quad.
Yeah.
And of course, this is the very element. This is what the Biden administration has been emphasizing. The March 2001 interim national security strategy, the importance of alliance, the importance of multilateralism. So if the competition would have to be waged here by the United States, it cannot do it alone. It has to be with its allies. More importantly, of course, something that's both close to our heart, the U.S.-Japan security partnership.
Yeah, no,
Yeah.
very well put, Renato. And look, history suggests you're right. The U.S. tends to focus on Southeast Asia when someone else is causing trouble and we are getting worried. But Japan pays attention all the time. So does Australia. And having alliances means listening to allies. So it sounds like your advice to Joe Biden would be listen on Southeast Asia. You need to also listen to Japan. And in the ICS polls, Japan is by far the most trusted country in ASEAN, far more than the US or China or Australia. So it's interesting. The ICS polls also note when asked, can Japan handle China alone in Southeast Asia? The answer is no. So listen to Japan, but bring in American power with Japan seems like the formula. Let me go to some of the questions. There's a question here from someone. How optimistic are you about the completion of the code of conduct in the South China Sea with China by this year's 2022 deadline? How likely is it that we will see this development happen, especially given Cambodia's obstinate reputation? So supposed to finish the code of conduct by 2022, at least to outside observers like me, it doesn't seem like very much is happening, and Cambodia has never been, well, particularly forceful vis-a-vis Beijing. Why don't we start with you, Bic? Are you following the code of conduct? Do you think we can expect any progress this year?
Yeah, for this year, I don't think it will happen. But, when we're talking about, the need to have a code of conduct, but I have some concern about that. What if, ASEAN and China agreed on code of conduct that is, based on China's terms, then that is not good. So,
Yeah.
we debate whether to have a code of conduct at all.
That's a good point. There could be a bad code of conduct. At one point, Beijing was saying the code of conduct should say there will be no exercises by outside military powers, meaning the U.S. or Japan. Yeah. Changbun, what do you think? And honestly, even if the code of conduct is finished, to be a bit of a skeptic, does it even matter? I mean, Beijing promised not to militarize the South China Sea and did. Beijing promised with Japan in 2008 to make the East China Sea a sea of cooperation and didn't. Does the code of conduct, I mean, for a skeptical Washington realist, why are we so obsessed with the code of conduct? Even if it's completed and it's a good one, do we believe China will follow it? What does it matter to Singapore?
Well, my view is the same as Bic. I'm not optimistic about making any substantive progress on the code of conduct on the South China Sea this year. I'm not even sure, there'll be substantive progress in 2023. And, the excuse is that, this is because of the pandemic, which has, sort of derailed the progress. But I think it's much more than that. Supposedly, Cambodia, because of being the ASEAN chair, could provide some complications. But I think it's much more than that, right? It's really, as you rightly pointed out, is to, what is the, there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered even at this point. What's going to be the enforcement mechanism, right? So what is the dispute resolution mechanism? What if a party is perceived as breaking that code? So what happens next, right? So these are all questions, inconvenient questions that I don't think have been even addressed at all in the discussions, right? And, I've heard some people say that, it's better to not to have any code at all, to have a bad code, right? If you have a bad code, it could end up constraining some of the options of Southeast Asian states. And at the same time, if if one party starts to, not follow the code at all, it will be a free for all, right? And there is a perspective that why even China is interested in having a code of conduct. And, one view is that it's trying to buy time. It's trying to buy time, it's trying to have protracted negotiations while trying to change facts on the ground. That is one view, right? So I'm not optimistic about the situation, but I think at least from Singapore's point of view, so long as there's no major incident, no accidental collision that leads to some kind of a military crisis, all is good, at least for now.
Renato, what do you think? We had another question from somebody asking if is there anything ASEAN can do or ASEAN member states can do to hold China accountable for violations of a code of conduct? And how does the question basically gets at this issue of cost imposition? Does ASEAN have the ability to impose costs? So you can answer the code of conduct prediction question. But
it's unfair to blame Cambodia for just in case a code of conduct would come out, because first, let's look at basically China's motive. Number one is fait accompli. As China militarized the area, China would say, let's freeze the situation. We already have those islands there. We have already transformed the South China Sea into the lake for the People's Liberation Army's Navy. Of course, another game plan of the Chinese is to keep the United States and Japan out of the equation. And the Philippine Foreign Secretary announced last year, no, a balance of power should have to be maintained. The U.S. Navy should continue operating in the South China Sea. We welcome the Australians and even the Brits and of course the Japanese Navy. So this basically would ruin China's plan for, the Chinese condition for a code of conduct. Just like I said, just a point you raised out. What kind of a code of conduct do we want? Do you want a code of conduct that's according to ASEAN game, ASEAN gambit, that we will have all the powers coming into the equation and balancing each other? Or a code of conduct would ensure that at the end of the day, we will only have one customer, and that is China. So that's the point. That's why President Xi Jinping promised President Duterte, the last time President Duterte visited China, by your earned terms in 2022 will have the code of conduct. Again, this is one of the unfulfilled promises of President Xi Jinping to President Duterte. Mark my word about it.
So we'll do this in a year and you can say you were right. You answered my question about cost imposition just now, which is if there can't be diplomatic progress, then the Philippines, Vietnam, other countries will be, forced to hedge more to bring in Japan, to bring in the Quad, to bring in AUKUS. That's the cost imposition, it seems you're saying, is that the countries in Southeast Asia can turn to other big powers to essentially impose a cost if China continues on this path. Of course, that's very bad for ASEAN unity and ASEAN centrality because, for example, the Philippines and Vietnam might be quite willing to call in Japan or the US, Cambodia, Laos, perhaps even Thailand might be more hesitant. So this ASEAN centrality and ASEAN cohesion mission gets complicated by imposing costs against China through great power cooperation. I have a bunch of really interesting questions about CPTPP. And a number of people in the audience want to know, Japan and Australia have made pretty clear statements about China's bid to join CPTPP, which are not saying no, but pretty negative. What is the view in ASEAN on China's bid to join the comprehensive progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership? So why don't we start with Nick, because Vietnam's opinion on this matters a great deal.
Yeah, so thanks. So I don't know if China joined CPTPP, it would make much difference in terms of Vietnam's trade dependence on China, because right now the level of dependence already very high, and as a member of ASEAN. Vietnam already signed 2 free trade agreements with China, the ASEAN-China Free Trade Area and RCEP. And I don't know if China joined the CPTPP, will it make any difference? I think the difference is the opportunity cost that the United States has to pay, not joining, but let China does that.
Chung Boon, there are reports that Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong welcomed China joining CPTPP. Was that just lip service?
It's interesting. The question itself rightly pointed out that if you look at the Chinese statement, it says that, our Prime Minister welcomes China's bid for CPTPP, but the Singaporean statement didn't mention anything at all, which, gives me the sense that, obviously I'm not privy to what's going on in those talks, but it gives me the sense that, I'm wondering if the Chinese are trying to corner us, at least openly into a certain kind of position. I think the official view is that, Singapore welcomes any party that is eligible to join CPTPP, right? And if China meets requirements, then of course, you're welcome to apply and
Yeah.
join if you meet the requirement, right? But meeting the requirement is a different matter and different question altogether, right? And I would say that I was a little bit surprised by China's bid, but I'm also not surprised by the timing at all. If you look at the timing, it's just one day after the announcement of ARKU. So I think there is a certain amount of political value. It's trying to, in a way, trying to make the Biden administration look bad. That look, the Biden administration is trying to, show up its military alliances, but we were trying to, cooperate economically. They're trying to do a contrast. I'm not sure it's going to work. And a lot of commentators have tried that, have wondered why even is China applying in the first place when chances of succeeding is I won't say it's impossible, but as it stands, it's not that good, right? Perhaps this is still an open question, and there are some people who wonder, they're probably thinking that the Chinese are betting that the Biden administration will not come back to CPTPP because of domestic political reasons. Well, that remains to be seen. I'm sure Southeast Asian states, in particular Singapore, would welcome, the US back to the CPTPP.
Please keep saying that. Please do keep saying that. Renato, here's a
We
question
will.
for you. Renato, a question
Okay.
for you, and you don't have to answer this, but I suspect you want to. Somebody asked you to predict the China policies of the top candidates in the election.
Well, we have 5 major candidates. 4 are kind of unanimous that, China is a challenge, but we have to deal with China. The arbitral ruling is important. China should recognize it. 4 of them. Then, of course, the alliance with the United States is important, varying degree. One of them, of course, earned his millions of dollars in Nevada, was very much, of course, very much for the alliance. I guess you know who I'm referring to.
Mhm.
A boxer who was very good friend, senator friend from Nevada. Nevada played a very important role during the election. So 4 of them are unanimous about this, except one, who incidentally was exiled in the United States in 1986, and is along with his family, and he's still blaming the United States for having his family exiled, and he has this sort of personal animosity. So he gave out a different statement. Number 1, China is the Philippines' best friend. The arbitral ruling is not valid because China is not a member of UNCLOS, and arbitration is not correct because China did not participate. We will engage China in a bilateral negotiation. And the 4th one, we don't need the mutual defense treaty because it will only trigger a war with China. So you have this basically, you have 5 candidates that are in one way or the other have this very suspicious, wary view of China. And you have this candidate that's trying to project the image that he could be. Remember a movie way back in the 50s, The Manchurian Candidate? Or sometimes we use the term the China candidate. Of course, we had one in 2016, but this Manchurian candidate in 2016 kept his cards close to his chest, not this candidate.
So
It's basically fun.
the key variable in how leaders in the Philippines view China is how they view the US, basically.
Yes, yeah.
And whether or not they feel some resentment for something or other. I mean, President Duterte is reportedly still angry about the wars in Mindanao 110 years ago. So
No, his
So
visa
it-
got canceled.
yeah,
No, that's the reason.
more recently, and other things. So good lesson for American diplomacy. Memories are long in Southeast Asia. Well, I want to thank you, all of you, Renato and Changbun and Nick. It's been a fascinating hour. We fit a lot in. You answered all the questions. Thank you for the questions from the audience. We'll do more of these dialogue seminars. Thanks to Eleanor Albert from the U.S.-China Dialogue Initiative and Kelly Liu from Asian Studies, and thanks to Tom Badshop, our Senior Vice President for Global Engagement at Georgetown. Hope you all enjoyed it, and terrific discussion. Enjoy the beach, Renato, and thank you, everyone.